Welcome. I'm Katherine Martineau, Assistant Professor of Asian Studies at Binghamton University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the event, the series, Mediating Justice, which I've co-organized with Julia Kowalski, Assistant Professor of Global Affairs at the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. We have been generously hosted by the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And before I describe our series and introduce our guests today, in the spirit of justice and in the spirit of seeing its absence, I would like to recognize that today's conversation about justice is organized upon the lands of Native peoples. The University of Notre Dame resides on the traditional homelands of the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and whom continue to do so. So Julie and I created this series to bring together anthropologists and peace studies scholars to discuss how ideas of justice thrive in particular contexts, inspired by recent events that have demonstrated again how complex yet urgent justice is as a concept. We turn not to philosophy or jurisprudence, but to the institutions and interactions that enact ideas of justice. We are asking, how do everyday practices reflect, reproduce, and change prevailing approaches to justice? Rather than seeking a universal definition of justice, we hope to explore how concepts of justice are mediated by the interactions, institutions, and conditions of their use. This series seeks to expand our understanding of how justice works, including how justice might work as a normative goal for our justice-seeking scholarship. So I'm delighted today to be here with two scholars, Professor Sameena Mulla and Alyssa Taylor. Dr. Mulla is a cultural and feminist anthropologist who works at the intersection of law and medicine. She's an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Sciences at Marquette University. Her first book, The Violence of Care, Rape Victims, Forensic Nurses, and Sexual Assault Intervention, draws on 4 years of participatory research in a Baltimore emergency room, and it addresses the roles of medical caregivers and legal practitioners amidst the complexity of survivors' experiences. Her more recent research is an ethnographic study of sexual assault trials in the Midwestern United States. And Alyssa Paylor is also with us. Alyssa Paylor is a peace studies practitioner and a Ph.D. student in Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. She holds a Master of Global Affairs with an International Peace Studies concentration from the University of Notre Dame. And she has over 6 years of experience working with grassroots organizations in Israel, Palestine, Myanmar, and Thailand. For her PhD research, Alyssa is examining concepts of reconciliation in a community of Israeli and Palestinian peace activists. So the conversation that we'll have today is open-ended. I will begin posing some opening questions and then invite each of you to reflect on your individual perspective to those questions. So the questions that we've posed to you are, what is the role of justice in your work? And how does justice operate as a focus of study and as a concept for the communities and the individuals that you work with? How do questions of justice shape your methods and your research practice? So first, I invite Sameena to share your perspective with us.
Thank you so much for having me today. I should just say, in terms of accessibility for someone who's not accessing this recording visually, I'm sitting in front of a photo of Beyonce Knowles in my home study in front of a beigey wall, and I'm a middle-aged Indian woman with curly dark hair and big hoop earrings, and I'm wearing a red sweater today and a black and white scarf, and I'm speaking to you from Menominee, Fox, Mascoutin, Sauk, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ho-Chunk land, among others, here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which has been the site of my field research for several years. And I'm excited to think a little bit more specifically about questions of justice in my work, which has to do with the adjudication presently of sexual violence, right? Namely rape cases, sexual assault cases. And I collaborated with a criminologist with a sociological background, and we did a collaborative ethnography together here in the courts over these past couple of years. So that book will be out in November. And it is built on my previous experience of spending time doing field research in an emergency room setting where forensic nurses were working with their patients who had come to the hospital in need of care following a sexual assault. And so I've been thinking very concretely about what questions of justice mean to those stakeholders in those particular moments, like thinking about needing care, needing healthcare, needing stability, needing the attention and expertise of a nurse. And in the United States, it's typical that it's nursing, highly trained forensic nurses who provide both care and also evidence collection, right? And what's interesting in that first study is that the idea of what constitutes justice is so clearly distinctive and sometimes disjunctured between the nursing community and the patients they're serving. Where for the professionals who are involved in the intervention, there might be greater investment in the formal criminal justice outcome of the case, whereas a patient might be articulating her needs in very distinctive ways. So there is this question as to, what constitutes justice? Is it a metric that's tied to some formal institutional question or outcome in this particular instance? Or is it individual or social or communal, right? What does being made whole look like from the perspective of this patient who's come forward, who will experience various sequelae, and who will carry that also into her kinship networks and into her community. And in the courts, right, you see a sense of mediating justice also in terms of how we are able to hear people's complaints, their forms of suffering, how those forms of suffering are rendered visible to the state through this process of adjudication. And so there, when one follows this question of seeking justice in a formal sense in the criminal justice system, there is a very concrete way in which the way that people experience harm is really highly mediated by a set of legal professionals, a set of statutory conditions, and that in itself is also much more process oriented than it is in terms of thinking about results. And I think a lot of our colleagues sometimes think of justice in terms of outcomes when we're not thinking ethnographically or on the ground. But whether someone feels good about a process, which is sometimes parsed through this question of procedural justice, right, has a lot more to do with their kind of personal sense of how they want to be made whole. Now, in my case, thinking about something like sexual violence or rape, right? What is justice from a metaphysical sense for me would be the end of all sexual violence, right? It's prevention. And that is, really distinct because when I look at forensic nursing responses or criminal justice responses or our court systems, those are their responses, right? That's the word I just used in terms of describing them. So they have a potential to be reparative, but we argue about whether they're preventative in any way whatsoever. And so in that sense, I find myself very doubtful, kind of taking a page out of my of the work of abolitionist colleagues who really don't see the way that some of these institutions actually lead us into a more just world, or a plurality of just worlds. We might not all be living in the same one. And so with this newer work, I've really had to ask myself, because sitting in the courts day after day in a city like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the spectacle of sexual assault prosecution is also a spectacle of racial subjugation and domination. And I should say that it is about the racial domination, not just of defendants, right, who are being held accountable for their actions, but also of the complainants. The people who come forward who have been harmed, right, are also subject to the racial logics of the court. And I would argue that in this case, it is the courts themselves, right, as a justice delivering mechanisms that are mediating how people live and experience race in a very gendered sense here in Milwaukee. So the court might not be making justice, but it is certainly reproducing race and racial hierarchy and gendered hierarchies as well. So I will pause there because I would love to hear how this work plays out in Alyssa's project.
Great, thank you. And thank you both to Kate and Julia for the invitation to participate today. It's nice to be able to talk about my work with a group of anthropologists. So certainly these questions of justice and what constitutes a just relationship between individuals and between communities is an important aspect of my research. Very broadly, I study how Israelis and Palestinians work together in the context of a structured reconciliation program to enact their own vision of ethical partnership and to advocate for a just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And where this research has started to take me is to a very interesting intersection between the implementation logic of peace-building programs, which on the one hand often focuses on changing or transforming or transitioning like the emotional internal conditions of their participants. And then on the other hand, to this much more politicized world of moral discourse about what it means to be a good Israeli citizen or what it means to be a good Palestinian citizen. So I've started to sort of look at how these things intersect. And most of my initial research has come from working with a fairly small group of bereaved individuals who have lost a family member. And for those that I've interacted with, they're all very committed to preventing other members of their communities from experiencing what they've gone through, from working as very vocal advocates in opposition to Israel's occupation of Palestine to doing more everyday things like trying to help transport Palestinians from checkpoints to hospitals in Israel. So they kind of run the gamut in terms of what types of activists they are. But by and large, they share a commitment to wanting to prevent what has happened to them happening to others. So I've started to consider, what I wanted to consider initially was why are they here? Why are they participating in a reconciliation program, which anthropologists like Laura Nader and Audra Simpson have described as like hegemonic harmony or as reconciliation machines? Like, why are they here participating when really, in terms of both communities, but particularly for the Palestinians, they're accused of participating in something that perpetuates the oppression of their own community. And this is often framed very much in like a nationalistic discourse, like, you know, you're not being a good citizen by participating in these programs. So I've had to explore how reconciliation programs, which in terms of peace studies often conceptualizes the individual as someone who can change emotionally, I've had to think about how these types of programs really start to map on ideas about like the emotional state of a national community, and then how that intersects with discourse about bereavement in Israel and Palestine, which it occurs in very interesting ways. There's very much a conception in both communities expressed in different ways that we celebrate those lives that have been lost in the name of the conflict, that this is a way in which we protect and secure our nation, or the way in which we move towards a direction of nationhood. And so for the activists I work with, they're really intent on challenging that. They're challenging sort of this affective state that their communities are in by saying, you know, we're bereaved and we are not willing to be used any longer to govern you, to justify what's happening here. So this is kind of how justice starts to arise in my research. I think for many of my interlocutors, they would say, you know, we work very hard together and we're in dialogue with one another, but this is not a realization of justice in its most profound and best sense. Like, it's something we're working towards. and we're having discussions about, but just because we can talk doesn't mean that we've achieved some form of justice. So yeah, anyway, I'd love to say more.
So one of the reasons I wanted to bring the two of you together, that we were excited to bring the two of you together, was something you've pointed out in your conversation so far, both of you, which is how you are both working in these situations of repair, right? Where there's been this injury or harm done, and that you have a variety of kind of professionals and then also the people who have experienced the harm coming together to try to seek some kind of repair afterwards. And yet the procedures are at stake, and a question, how do those procedures allow for some kind of justice to emerge? And then also all of those people involved may see actually participation in it as undercutting some kind of movement toward justice. So I guess I'm interested to pull out some more those experiences, the kind of different ways that the people that you're working with might see justice. What is it that they're longing for? Like, what is it that, like you were saying, Sameena, that for you it's prevention, like hands down prevention, right? But what about for the people that you're there with, right?
So, you know, it's this has definitely been a project in which I have to track my own investments in what's happening around me. And it was one of the reasons why it was really instructive to collaborate, not only with Heather Halafka, who's my co-author and co-ethnographer and is my partner in this, but also some of our students who we took into the courthouse with us, most notably Amber Powell. And we experienced the courts, right, not just in terms of like what we longed for in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of how people perceived us. And so Amber is African-American. I actually don't read very transparently in Milwaukee. And so sometimes I get Latina, and sometimes people do identify that I'm Indian, or sometimes they think I don't know what. And then Heather is white. And so the, who people thought we could possibly be and who we were affiliated with, right, was really interesting to me in terms of thinking about, this, if we think about it as a reconciliation machine of a type, like how we were all being thrust into roles, even though we were there as researchers, right? So Amber was always assumed to be there in support of the defendants, right? And I was sometimes thought to be a worker in the courtroom, sometimes not. Heather was often assumed to be a social worker or an attorney herself, right? And so I really did have a sense that there was something being made, and that this isn't antithetical to questions around justice, because, in terms of, what is the rightness of the world that people see, being in the courts as something that is part of your kind of world making experience, there was a way in which, that racializing order was really, really important to everybody who's participating, right? And the other piece of it for me is, there's a moment, and we used it at the very end of the book, where we sat through a very, very long, difficult trial, which involved a father's abuse of his own daughter. And his partner, this child's mother, spent, a lot of time on the stand testifying, and partly also testifying about her own horror that she hadn't been aware of what was going on. And he was convicted, he was found guilty, and it was very hard for everyone to hear what had happened to this child. The child herself spent 5 hours on the stand describing it over 2 days, right? And so as we were there was a sense in which, like, is this good for this child, right? What is this process demanding of this small person? And it was very easy in the moment to be quite relieved about the conviction, except in the hallway afterwards, months later, actually, at the sentencing, the mother of this child and her other children begged the district attorney to argue for leniency, not because she wanted her partner to have access to her children, but because we had many children together and he was the provider. And so she was being forced out into a world where his income would not now support their family, right? I mean, it wasn't even in terms of affective things. And so I think about this carceral system in the United States in which we're not supposed to technically have collateral consequences, but we are taking somebody out of their household economy. And there are such huge consequences. And the district attorney's response to this woman was to give her what we call the girlfriend talk. She got kind of sassy, and there's this sort of instant blackface moment where she's like, "Girlfriend, you don't need him. You're going to be okay." And then that sheds away. And she was doing it as a form of solidarity, but it was also a promise she couldn't make, because the system is not set up to sustain this person in the ways that she's calling for, that she's very clearly calling for. She called for during the sentencing hearing too, and on the record. And she said, "I know he's done these things. I have zero doubts about it, but here's why I'm going to ask you for a lenient sentence," right? And it's tied to livelihood. And in my early work, people would constantly come back to livelihood. You're in the middle of a rape crisis intervention, getting care from a nurse, and what are you asking for is a note to describe to your employer why you had to miss work, right? Those really basic needs, people feel a desire for them. And so with so much inequality, right, I think that while we think of these forms of harm as rape or sexual assault as very acute forms of harm, they actually are eruptions of inequality in terms of how that harm is experienced. So those are just some examples from my work.
Thank you. Alyssa, do you want to respond or add?
Yeah, I think a really good example of when this became very clear to me was when I was observing one of these programs. There was a process where, it's a program that's sort of staged. So towards the end of the second day of the program, the people that are participating in it, both Israeli and Palestinian, are asked to start brainstorming. How can we bring this message to our communities? How can we promote reconciliation? How can we advocate for peace? And one of the staff members that runs the program said to me, "Oh, this is the part I hate the most. They never have any good ideas." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean they never have any good ideas?" And she's like, "You'll see, you'll see." So I sat and watched, and there's this like very intense sort of emotional community that this group of people have made with one another. But then when they sit down to start talking about action, the actions don't align with like the intensity of the commitment that they feel towards like one another's plight. And particularly, I think for many of the Israelis in those groups, they feel very limited by what they can actually do and achieve. And for many of the Palestinians, they have very clear things that they want to end. We want the military out of our territory. We want to be able to have a livelihood. We want to make sure that our children can grow up healthy and safe. And there's very much a misalignment. So when I was observing this program, it became very clear to me that that was the case, because they would talk about their need to get together with one another, to feel connected. And then one of the Palestinian participants said, "Yes, I want this. And also, summer camps and things like that are nice. Hummus and stories are nice. But, my child was shot in the back of the head by a soldier the day after he attended a summer camp. Like, what do you want me to do with this?" And it's very unresolved. Justice in this sense is very unresolved. It's beautiful what they've made together, but there's a lack of resolution.
Could I jump in with a question? Because I think there's really something that resonates with me when you talked about, just briefly mentioned, Alyssa, that it's a really structured program and process, right? And I kind of think about the ritual of these formal processes. And so I guess one question I have is, what's the importance of these sort of ritual structures around the questions of approaching justice? Like, does it matter to the people who are participating in the programs, do you think, in the same ways as those who run the programs, right, who are not pleased with the result? And then the second question is, what do we do with the question of power, right? Because in the, formal sense of mediation as a kind of legal process. Mediators stumble frequently with this question of power because parties approach, the process with differential power, but the mediator has to kind of find a place. So, and I think about that in terms of your interlocutors and what they're telling you, right? It's a complaint about power. So do you have any observations about justice and power and justice in let's say institutions or rituals?
Yeah, those are really good questions, and I'll take a stab at answering them and then perhaps ask you a bit about your research, because maybe that would give me some ideas. I do think this question of ritual is very, very important. Something I've learned as both a peace studies student and then as a student of anthropology is that focus on process plays a very important role. And I've started to ask, for whom does this process matter? Does it matter for the people in the programs that are participating? I don't know. This is an interesting thing to think about. But where I've focused my attention more recently is, why does this focus on process matter? For whom does it matter? And it often comes back to, the people, the funders, the people designing the programs, the USAIDs and the EUs of the world that are saying, like, this is how we think you can achieve reconciliation and peace. And let us lay out for you a very complex process that if you comply with, you not only get funding, but we think you'll achieve something good here. And like, of course, there's a ton of like more localized agency, as we like to say, but there's an element there. And I'm trying to put those two together in a more sophisticated way. So that's actually more the direction my research has taken lately. And maybe that starts to speak to this question of power. Like, why are certain institutions so invested in the design of like the neutral mediator or the neutral institution? What are they trying to get out of that? So maybe I would ask you, like, how have you seen perhaps this idea of like the neutral arbiter of the court really interact with the racial dynamics of power that you see?
That's a good question. And so, I would say that the court claims the space of, even saying the law is race neutral, right? Because the law doesn't include any direct language around race. But the actions of the law are far from race neutral. And the juries, right, that are drawn to make these decisions, or the judges who decide pre-trial, right, whether something is going to move forward, like absolutely bring their entire biography. And what's really interesting to me about being an anthropologist in the US is some of us for a while, I think, have kind of gotten away without provincializing where we work as much as we should have. And so having done fieldwork in Maryland and Wisconsin, I'm telling myself, wow, these are totally different, right? Because the investment in the kind of neutral mediator is partly about like shedding context, shedding the burden of parsing history, right? Which one can't do in the process of reconciliation. Reconciliation processes typically own the question of history in a much more, I think, complex or at least direct way. Where the courts absolutely do not, right? They exist, they think outside of time, except through the role of precedent, right? And routine, case law, and precedent subscribing law. And so court records become a place where all of that racial inequality accrues. So, one of the big differences is Wisconsin, for example, has, between Wisconsin and Maryland, the statutes are actually different. So what you have to prove is different. But the other thing that's very different here is how local communities are policed. And it's not in the sense of, racial disparities don't exist in Maryland, they do, but the intensity of those racial disparities in terms of policing and arresting and sentencing are pretty, intensified here in Wisconsin. So a lot of minoritized people come before the courts with a record. And that already puts you in a position, right, where you are much more likely to be convicted of further crimes, right, that happens. And I've been really, well, I guess I would say initially, maybe I was naive about the extent to which people really draw on local geography when they think about race and what it means. We interviewed a lot of attorneys about how they select juries, right? And they really tiptoe, most of them, around questions of race. They're very indirect when they're selecting a jury, but in terms of how they approach jury selection, they know exactly what they're looking for and who they're looking for. And I found that, and that's prosecutors and defense attorneys. And so in that sense, I was like, well, that's actually a very direct approach. The attorneys are very direct about power and race and how it functions and how it works against their case and how it works for their case. And the judges are very uncomfortable when we point to racial disparities in outcomes. And yet, we'll say things, sentencing especially, that are, absolutely like proxies for race. They'll talk about, they talk about your family and your background and whether you've been well parented and whether you have a community that will hold you accountable. And that translates into whether you will be incarcerated or whether you will be on what we call extended supervision. We don't have parole really in this state. And so guess whose communities aren't fit for return to? Guess whose homes don't have adequate kind of moral guidance, right? But it's very difficult to get judges to think about their role in those decisions. And so I think they mask these outcomes in this neutral space, and also in, there's a range of instruments that get consulted. Different, some of them are black boxed algorithms that there are many lawsuits and studies going on about right now. What I find fascinating is, at one point I counted like 11 different instruments. So, let's say that they actually work. None of them are designed to talk to each other. So you have like 11 different tools that give you a risk of reoffending. And so they also hide behind technology, I would say, in terms of claiming to be a neutral decision maker. So those are just some of the things.
I'm very aware of the time and noticing that we need to move toward a conclusion. So I want to open up the floor. I love these questions, and I love how you're bringing together the kind of insufficiency of justice as a concept for thinking through the complexity of the inequities that it must be created within. And so I want to invite both of you to provide any final reflections or comments. Alyssa, would you like to, you got to ask a question, would you like to reflect at the end here?
Sure. I mean, I think I was very struck by what Sameena just said about like reconciliation as a process that sort of owns this question of history, and how history and sort of the structuring of time is part of how we understand what justice may or may not be, either in the future or accounting for something that has happened in the past. And I think this question needs to be unpacked a lot more for me in terms of like, how do I see history being turned into something that's like material, part of this process, part of this ritual? What are they doing with history and previous events that maybe points to ideas about the future? So that has been very productive, and I just want to thank you for that.
Sameena?
I can't wait to read more about Alyssa's work in the future. I think I concur completely, and I also think about justice as multiple. I think anthropologists really are poised to be able to provide meaningful descriptions of what justice might mean in a particular milieu or space. And I think we should be comfortable with that multiplicity even within a single space, right? I think all of the research participants that we've been talking about, right, aren't necessarily united in their orientations towards justice. And, I'm always trying to think about how I can get out of this sense of like, what do you even do with procedural justice in the context of history or in the context of, a deep racial wound or gender disparity, right? And so, I find myself returning to this question of right relations. Like what if we, again, coming back to scholars like Audra Simpson and others who kind of orient us towards thinking about, what would it mean if justice was oriented by the notion of bringing distinctive parties who choose to participate in those processes into right relations with one another? Would that look different? Like what would be facilitated there? That has a political economy. That's what Alyssa is telling us, right? There's funders and there's institutions, like there's a materiality to it too. And that materiality might overdetermine, what pathways or possibilities there are there. So if we could decouple them and resource this coming into right relationship with one another, and that has to unfold in temporalities that we're not able to accommodate right now. Like we foreclose those. We want it finished, right, within the 2-day seminar or within the 3-day trial or all of those things. So I think time is part of the equation for me as well.
Thank you, both of you. This is wonderful to be part of. Thank you. And I want to thank the Kroc Institute for hosting us, and especially Director of Kroc, Asher Kaufman, Communications Director, Hannah Heinziker, and Events Manager, Lisa Gallagher. And we invite you to watch our other dialogues, which will be posted during February and March, and then to join us for our series Capstone Live event on April 7th with Professor Kumari Maxine Clark, who's Professor of Anthropology at UCLA and the author most recently of the book Effective Justice, the International Criminal Court and the Pan-Africanist Pushback. So we hope you'll join us for that. Thank you.